Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Factory Reset webinar, our first in a series. I'm your host today, Vicki Hansen. Today we're going to talk about the challenges of living, working, and making in times of COVID-19, where there's no playbook and no best practices for us to follow. We'll share what our clients are telling us and what they're going through, and into some simple yet critical considerations, not only for weathering the storm today, but for creating resiliency and agility in your business for tomorrow, because we all know the next disruption is right around the corner. For today's session, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We've got Paul Bresnahan, our head of manufacturing sector in the Americas region of Fujitsu, as well as Karsten Scherer, our vertical analyst lead at Fujitsu as well. But before I hand it over, I have a couple of housekeeping items. First, please note that we are recording today's session and we will share it with you after the meeting today. And second, we're going to be able to take a few questions at the end. So if you have a question you want to ask, use the Ask a Question tab at the bottom of your player. If we don't get to your question, not to worry, we will follow up with you after the fact. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand things over to Karsten. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Vicki. Paul, it's nice to see you. I think it's been 9 months since I saw you in person, and we've both grown beards in the meantime.
Great to see you, Karsten.
Likewise. As we were bouncing around ideas as to what to call this set of webinars, and given the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, the phrase factory reset kept on making it on back to the list. And so I took the liberty of looking up a definition. This one's from TechTarget. So they define it as a hard reset, also known as a factory reset or master reset, is the restoration of a device to the state it was in when it left the factory. All settings, applications, and data added by the user are removed. And it just seemed like an appropriate metaphor for the challenges of manufacturing in general, but in particular, given 2020 and the COVID, and not in the sense of resetting backwards towards an established way of doing things, but more resetting forwards to something new in terms of thinking and structure. Now, you've been in the industry for a good long while, and you've seen a thing or two. What's your take on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting situation manufacturers find themselves in, and many of the things that we talk about today, Industry 4.0, implementing IoT, implementing machine learning, none of those things are new for a manufacturer. In fact, that dialogue has been going on for the last 10 years. And manufacturers have kind of been slowing the pace of that adoption of those technologies, leaning more back to some of the traditional techniques and some of the more manual techniques, because they've just been able to survive within that structure. And I think, as we spoke to manufacturers and we went out and researched with them, we get very familiar answers from all of them. 80% of manufacturers would say, yeah, over the next 3 to 5 years, I'm going to implement Industry 4.0. And yet, over the next 3 to 5 years, I expect some of those digital priorities to change. So we kind of saw that as common. And then COVID hit. And what COVID did is really drove what you just described there, Karsten. It's this reset, because we disrupted the world and disrupted the economy with COVID. And it really had an impact on the manufacturing industry. In fact, for the early months, they shifted into a recession-style structure. And it forced manufacturers to really rethink where they were with applying technologies. And what we saw was the haves and the have-nots. So those who had applied a lot of the digital net technologies were able to be responsive to what COVID brought. Those that hadn't found themselves in a real difficult situation. They couldn't review their supply chains because they had no visibility into it. They couldn't adopt to change because they didn't have the agility in the plants. They couldn't even keep the plants open because they were heavily dependent on a manual-based workforce. And the second that they needed to bring safe separation, they really struggled to maintain productivity within the plants. And then a lot of them had zero visibility into their customer demand channel, instead dependent on others within that channel. And the second things began to change, they really didn't have the insight. So what we're finding now with these manufacturers is, yeah, it's a reset, and what they thought they were going to do over the next 3 to 5 years, they're now looking to do over the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, that's an interesting one too, Paul. And there's a lot. I mean, this has been covered quite a bit and we've seen the phrase frequently. We're doing a decade's worth of digital transformation in the span of, and we've been forced to, because COVID is a forcing function, to do that in the span of 6 to 9 months. And so I think that that agility and speed to adoption is a critical aspect that manufacturers are looking at now. And I love your thoughts too on, we've been talking about the phrase digital transformation has been ubiquitous for years at this point. And I think it's safe to say and fair to say that there's a fair amount of fuzziness around what that means and how it's defined from customer to customer, organization to organization. Do you feel like COVID has forced a new pragmatism around looking at technology and putting that towards use cases and truly transforming versus acquiring technology?
Yeah, I think pragmatism is a good word, Karsten. And what kind of we see in this, COVID economy? Let's describe that as an economy that's uncertain, unpredictable. We're kind of going into a second wave right now. We've just seen major lockdown in Europe. It's a very difficult environment, and pile on top of that the things that we were previously seeing with some of the trade struggles and wars that were going on, some of the shift of the countries towards bringing things back home. We were kind of already having a lot of complexity, and then COVID added to it. So pragmatism is really important. And what we're seeing across our manufacturing base is they're all typically doing 3 key things. The first thing they're doing is reevaluating their supply chains. Most of them have had the experience of I can't get the raw materials I need. I'm finding it really difficult to move goods between even states because they've got different COVID rules. My demand's gone through the roof, or my demand's collapsed. If I'm in the airline industry, I'm really struggling right now. But if I'm a paper producer making toilet paper, well, I can't produce it fast enough. So they're reevaluating their supply chains to understand where the challenges are within it. Where don't I have a visibility? Where do I need agility? So it's really causing a rethink there. The second thing that they're doing is rethinking where they're spending the money. So based on that evaluation, what we're seeing manufacturers doing is being pragmatic and say, you know what, I need to spend money on these things because right now I'm hurting with COVID and I need to be making this spend. Or I need greater productivity out of my plants, or you know what, I'm shutting my plants down, but I'm going to take this as an opportunity to get ready for the ramp up that's going to come. So they're rethinking that priority of where they're spending their money and what projects and initiatives they're prioritizing, particularly within the factories. And then the next thing they're doing is reprioritizing for the future. We've seen changes that are never going to reverse. We work with Mars. And their pet food division, well, they've seen their e-commerce orders go from 8 to 10% to 30+% in a very short period of time. They've seen their channels double in terms of the volume of channels that they're having to service. They've seen retailers asking them to ship direct to consumer. We're not going to see a regression from that shift as a result of coming out of COVID. People have spent the last 8 months getting used to that environment. They're going to spend another 8 months doing it. It's not going to change. Fujitsu alone just announced a couple of months ago that we're probably not going to move nearly half of our workforce back into the offices. We're creating an environment where more than 70,000 people can now continue to work on from home because we've just seen some benefits associated with that. That's going to have an impact on the economy and everything that sits around it. So it's really forcing manufacturers to step back and reprioritize where they're making their spend and their journey to Industry 4.0. And another thing I constantly hear from manufacturers is the labor force. So we see this shift of people staying at home and ordering from home, and we've seen this boom in transportation and logistics, this boom in people going out and being your shopper on Instacart or driving your product to your home. Well, that's a labor force that typically is available to the manufacturer, and now it's being offered alternative work environments that people are shifting towards. I was speaking to a manufacturer just the other day. He's got 4,000 open roles he's struggling to fill. So again, Industry 4.0 is going to be really key as we start to create more robotics and digitization, and also generate this new style worker to attract that workforce. So we're really going to have to reprioritize as manufacturers based on that.
And what you said about the the future aspect and planning for that, I think resonates for everybody, not just in manufacturing, but across all industries. And it occurred to me a couple of days ago that a phrase that I've heard next to 0 times this year that was really frequent in years past was future-proofing the organization. I think the pandemic has shown that that's much easier said than done. And even just in tracking what thought leaders like Gartner, IDC, Forrester, and everybody else says, they're not focusing on the pandemic mitigation strategy anymore as they did in the beginning. It's much more around disruption management in general. How do you ruggedize your organization? How do you drive resiliency and agility into your operations, end-to-end visibility, all the stuff that you described earlier? How do they gain the ability to identify and pivot away from threats, but also identify and pivot towards opportunities? So how does this change how manufacturers are, I guess, essentially evolving their organizations?
Yeah, so what we're seeing across the manufacturers is kind of this dual vision, to use a better, rather than kind of a different description. That what they're seeing is, hey, I've got immediate things I need to fix right now, but I also recognize that priorities are changing and my future is changing in terms of the way I'm going to engage with my customers, engage with my employees, engage within my business. So we're seeing manufacturers kind of trying to manage this complexity of, hey, I've got to do some things right now, but I want to do things where I'm not throwing them away because my future is going to look different and I need to adjust to that. So we're seeing this kind of concept of making sure we understand where we're trying to get to and making sure we're taking stepping stones along the way to get us there, but at the same time, prioritizing the things that we need to prioritize right now to deal with the impact of COVID. So that's a difficult time for a manufacturer, and that's hard to do. I always kind of like to describe the manufacturer as the atom in comparison to the finance industry as the bits. I think in finance, we've seen technology as being a core part of the way they work for the last 20, 25 years. Is when you go and talk to a manufacturer, finance company now, it's very difficult to distinguish between business and IT because IT is the way they engage you through mobile apps and mobile wallets and all sorts of different things. For a manufacturer, kind of the back-end operations run by IT has been a little bit separated from the manufacturing and production environment run by the plant manager. And we're seeing those things coming together, and they're having to learn these new ways of working together because traditionally they've just kind of worked around each other, hence the description, the atom. So they're dealing with a lot of things right now in manufacturing. They're having to bring business and IT to really think about how do I apply digital quickly and in a considered way to tackle the problems I see today. But then they're also looking at longer term, and longer term, remember now, isn't 3 to 5 years, it's 12 to 18 months. Where do I need to be in that time period? So when we come out of this COVID environment and we start to see a recovery, we're ready for that. And we're ready for the new norms that are going to exist in that world. So what we're kind of advocating to our manufacturers as we work with them is kind of these 3 things. Is the last 6 months has been all about respond. How do I make my plant safer for my employees to work? How am I getting rid of those danger areas like, hey, when I come into the plant at the start of my shift, there may be 200 or 300 people in a reception trying to punch their card and get into the manufacturing facility, as well as at the same time, the previous shift of 200, 300 people is coming out. Well, that's a disaster for spreading COVID. So now I need to use some technology that's going to allow my people to move in and out in a more managed way, still being able to track them and even know what machinery they've worked on. And if they're diagnosed with COVID, who worked on that machine 20 minutes up to 20 minutes later, because we know that the virus can survive for a period of time. So they're implementing those type of solutions that are allowing them to keep the factories open and keep them open safely. But the other thing we're seeing is those who are really winning in the COVID space, and that for us, that's the majority of our CPG customers. They've really got to get products out the door. If they can make it, they can sell it. And so what we're working with them on there is things that give them greater productivity. So for example, we're working with a large paper company in Canada right now. We're helping them deploy overall equipment effectiveness into their plants so they can drive greater productivity. they're going to build some new facilities to cope with the demand, but that new facility isn't going to be live now, and they need greater productivity now, and digital is the way to achieve that. The second thing that we're advocating to the manufacturers is think about the recovery. So we've just seen in the last quarter, in fact, just last month, one of the biggest order records in the last 17 years for the manufacturing industry. We're seeing people in lockdown move their expenditure away from the service industry towards goods and products. So as a result, we've seen like a boom for the manufacturers, and that was reflective in data just published in the last month. Now, during COVID, we saw a depletion of stock. So now we find the situation of a manufacturer of, hey, I've got growing demand and I've got low stock. So that's kind of really laying out the pathway for the next 3 to 4 months for many manufacturers of ramping up production to cope with that. So we've been working with manufacturers to get ready for that. How am I deploying plant maintenance so I get greater throughput through my plants and downtime? How am I moving towards predictive so that I can start getting greater throughput from my plants and less downtime? So we're really helping that. And then the concept of control tower, so I can have visibility across my supply chain, so I can be responsive to maybe changes of raw material or responsive to new demand levels from my customers. So we're kind of helping that space, which is immediacy for manufacturers right now. The second thing we're doing is, or the third thing we're doing is helping them plan for Thrive. So as we come out of the other side of COVID, we are going to see things are going to be different. We talked earlier about the challenge of getting employees and workers is going to be different. We're reading a lot of material today about people divesting their manufacturing facilities away from just low-cost centers to bringing them more and closer to in proximity to where they're providing the services. Well, that's going to require greater automation in those plants to overcome the cost of the labor and the workforce. So we're going to have to think through those things. The other thing we're seeing quite a lot of is in this kind of demand channel, for particularly for the CPG and even those who are providing into the service industry. These channels are growing. You know, the days of, hey, I had my large pallet distribution, I had my small distribution for e-commerce, I've kind of gone, and now I'm doing large pallet, I'm doing small distribution, I'm holding stock for powerhouse retailers like Amazon or Walmart. I'm having to do direct to consumer for them. So those manufacturers who've kind of kept those things as separate channels and now finding they're having to run crazy inventory to cope with the volume that's been created across those multi-channels. So they're having to rethink that whole demand channel. How do I create intelligent allocation so that I can manage my inventory better? How do I collapse my fulfillment models so that I can optimize the environments I've got rather than trying to run these discrete channels that are making me and forcing me to drive greater volumes of inventory to cope with that? So we're going to see definite changes that stay long term, and the manufacturer is going to have to start deploying solutions to cope with that. So we're kind of working in those 3 buckets, helping those manufacturers think through that. Karsten.
Thank you. Yeah, and I sort of had to laugh to myself as you were describing the shift from, let's say, services oriented spend towards consumer goods spend. I actually thought the odds of somebody delivering an Amazon package while we were doing this is pretty high. So it might still happen between now and the end of the webinar. But one of the things that has caught my eye here, and also that has come out in conversations with customers, is we have this structure: respond, recover, thrive. Everybody has developed something similar in the meantime. But one of the things that we've been finding is that it's very difficult to create, and let's just call it connective tissue, between the investments a manufacturer makes in that 0 to 6 month and that respond phase, right? We have an immediate emergency need. We need to build something tomorrow, keep our workers safe, keep our people productive, understand supply chain, like tier 1, tier 2 vendors, all of that stuff. And then the tension is between solving an immediate need and then, as you said, what gets you to thrive? Because what gets you to thrive to a certain extent is also the platform you start building if you're visionary to a certain extent, but also just simply lucky enough to have made the right bets in 0 to 6 and 6 to 12 months, and kind of sort of create a momentum and a basis upon which investments lie. And then that future vision around direct to consumer, if you didn't have that before, as an example, which in CPG is huge now. What are your thoughts on that? Like how does a manufacturer level the playing field in their favor around building that momentum?
Yeah, I think you know what we advocate to a manufacturer is think big. So if we kind of believe in that the deployment of digital transformation is now no longer a 3 to 5 year model, and it's a 12 to 18-month model, and I think we're all in agreement on that, we're seeing it, then think big is really thinking about what I'm going to look like in 18, 24 months from now. Because we're going to make, as you said, reset, fundamental change within our manufacturing operations, whether that's in the supply to the factory operations itself, or the demand channel out of the factory to whatever our endpoint B2B or B2C environment looks like. So think big. You've got to have the viewpoint of where you're going to be in that next 18 to 24 months. And there's a lot of data that can help you think that through, and organizations like Fujitsu can help you think that through, see that across multi-manufacturers. And then you've got to start, not necessarily small, but start with the right initiatives. We talked about prioritizing things within the factories or prioritizing things in your demand channel. So you've got to choose those right initiatives. And what we're saying is, let's move away from the concept of POC, because reality is most of this technology has been out for the last 5-7 years. We don't have to prove it works. What we have to prove is it creates value within the manufacturer's environment. So we're seeing less and less of those POCs in standalone environments, and more of these production-ready proof of values, actually implementing it somewhere within the manufacturer's live operations to prove that the value can be achieved. And then once we achieve that, the concept is, how fast can I scale it? And that's where organizations like Fujitsu come alongside of you to bring you that speed of acceleration in scale. I referenced earlier the paper company that we're working with in Canada. We were able to very quickly with them define that what was going to help them drive greater productivity out of their plants to cope with the demand that they got was a kind of a smart start point for them was overall equipment effectiveness. We were able to deploy a very simple proof of value within a plant and demonstrate that they could achieve the value that they're looking for. And now we're scaling that across the rest of their plants across the US in a very, very short period of time, because they need that benefit now. Now, once we've established that platform, tying it back to think big, we know the end point of where they want to get to. So now we can start building on top of that with other building blocks that take them towards that end point. So that's really where you kind of need to be as a manufacturer and think that through. Like, I might build agility within my factories, and at the same time, I'm trying to build greater visibility into my demand channel. Those two things go hand in hand. So you want to think those things through. So think big is important. Start in the right place with a proof of value, not concept, live in your production environment, and then scale it quickly. That's what we're advocating as Fujitsu.
Excellent, thank you. And I think, and you and I have talked about this many times, and you mentioned this earlier, there's really no such thing as the 5-year plan anymore in manufacturing. There's the pace of change, even without disruption, is simply too rapid. And we've clearly been shown by 2020 that the just-in-time philosophy of manufacturing and distribution and supply chain has very much now shifted to all of the agility and resiliency stuff that we were talking about earlier. Now it was just in time, now it's just in case. And I think that to your last point, and maybe to close this before we take questions, it takes a village more now than it ever has, in terms of the platforms, ecosystems, partnerships, suppliers, some of the incredibly innovative things we've seen this year with companies that were competitors in 2019, cooperating around certain projects because there was a need and it made sense to do so. So I think it's a highly stressful and highly innovative time for manufacturing, and I think with that, we'd love to field any questions, Vicky, if we've gotten any come in through the chat.
Actually, we do have a couple, so let me dive right in. And I actually would enjoy hearing from both of you on this, but maybe Paul, this one maybe starts with you. So this one is, you're saying to start small. What does start small look like for a typical manufacturer?
Yeah, and I think I'd add to that, not just small, but start in an area that adds value. So we see that differing depending on where the manufacturers finding themselves right now within the COVID environment that we're in. So I'll give a couple of examples. I talked earlier about the paper company, and what their challenge is they can't make enough product. So for them, start small is a simple area within the factory to implement overall equipment effectiveness. These are not massively complex projects to do and can actually be done in a very short period of time to bring that benefit. So start small, take a line, implement it, show the proof of value, get the business bought into it, allow the plant and production managers to see it in operations, and then scale it quickly. So we're advocating that. You might be somebody like Mars, where you've seen over a very short period of time for your pet food business, you've gone from 8 to 10% e-commerce to 34, 35% e-commerce. You've gone from 1 to 2% direct to consumer to 10 to 12% direct to consumer. You've seen new demand channels open up as Amazon expects you to hold stock for them. Chewy expects you to hold stock for them. They want differing sizes. They want you to meet different SLAs. They expect the product to have a certain life depending on whether it's on a pallet or whether it's being shipped direct to the consumer. So that complexity has meant where Mars needed to start was to implement an order and inventory management solution that could take advantage of digital and give them a greater way to engage with their distribution channel. And then that data feeds back to them to give them information to drive intelligent allocation. So you can see, I don't have to solve everything at once. I can really tackle my big problems, but I'm tackling them knowing full well that as I implement these solutions, they're going to give me another level of capability and another level of data that I can build upon towards my bigger plan.
And maybe to add to what you just said is the pragmatism that we were talking about earlier, right? Like technology investment without a target is just spent money. But if the use case around that is geared towards solving an immediate need, to your point about operational efficiency, then that's a clear path to go down that you can start fairly quickly with. So it's not just the start small, as Paul said. It's also prioritize. Hedge your bets a little bit, but prioritize towards the biggest possible impact given the immediate needs. And in our planning processes for years in manufacturing and others have been based on year after year historical data, and all of that's been wiped away this year because the data that feeds into the systems that we normally rely on, many of them are either they're either flatlined or they're at capacity. Like the CPG and the paper products company. So those are good ways of thinking about that start small, I think. What else we got, Vicki?
Interesting. Thank you, Karsten and Paul. We do have one more question. One of my core issues relates to supply chain logistics. A good example is what I saw in the news today, that we've got another shortage of N95 masks. How are manufacturers working through these types of supply chain issues?
Yeah, so let me kick that off, Karsten, and then you can go and add to it. I think there's kind of a couple of things that are really important for the manufacturer from that perspective. One is they've got to have visibility. So the number of manufacturers we talk to who are living off historical data and don't actually know until after an event has happened what's going on with their supply chain, that's a real challenge. So we're advocating the concept of control tower, where manufacturers can start to have greater visibility in what's going on in their supply chain. It's very hard to react if you can't see. So we advocate see. And then we also then advocate agility. So where do I need the ability to adjust based on what's happening in my supply chain? So maybe I need to adjust because I can't get the raw materials that I need anymore, and I have to put something through my manufacturing process that's different. Or maybe a different product of mine is receiving greater demand, so I want to reconfigure my plants to support that. So knowing that those are the demands on you, those are the risks within your supply chain, is deploying solutions that enable that. And then as part of that greater visibility in the consumer demand, I think a number of manufacturers have been remiss of saying, hey, I'm just going to supply into this supply chain to my dealer or to my distributor or to my retailer, and I'm really dependent on them to tell you my customer sentiment and what the demand channels are going to be. Well, what we're seeing is we really don't have a good view on customer sentiment. We're seeing that during COVID, a lot of things are influencing the purchasing decision that we never thought of before. So we're advocating manufacturers have greater visibility into that by having more real-time connectivity with those different demand channels, so they can source banning information that's helping them drive better the production and the products that they're producing and developing. So again, none of these are new concepts in moving to Industry 4.0. They've concepts that have exist. We're just now seeing the very compelling business case to implement them.
I think, yes, absolutely. And the only thing I would add to that is that it's, COVID has shown, and disruption in general shows sometimes the disconnects within organizations. It's less the customer facing piece and more the way that parts kind of move through the value chain. And in manufacturing, of course, that's just a much higher factor, because there's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. The value chain from end to end is much longer, and it requires often physical assets. And so anything that helps a manufacturer adjust and pivot quickly. Nobody gets a crystal ball now that says in 3 months this will happen, or there'll be an outbreak there, or there'll be a trade issue here. But we can help our organizations have better sort of feelers to sense things more quickly when they come, and then adjust to that. And I think the K or the N95 mask example that you just had is a great example of that.
Thank you so much, Karsten, and thank you, Paul, and thanks to all of our attendees for today. As a reminder, we'll have the recording made available to you very shortly, so stay tuned for that. Thank you again. You may now disconnect.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.